this opportunity to make a appreciation note. Thank you so much, Izzy and Josh, my dear and respected teammates. You have patiently mentored and supported me in the past few weeks and during this tournament. Without them, I cannot stand here. I also want to thank everyone from months we have supported and celebrated each other during this journey, and we are a big family. As a conclusion, I would like to not acknowledge my debate homeland, China, where I started to debate and grow without all the support and inspiration I get from my China friends and from China circuit. I cannot go this far, and I deeply wish more Chinese debaters can be heard in bigger platforms like Izzy's. My speech will start. 3, 2, 1. The horrible crime may not be done under active evil attention, but under negligence. We are in a powerful position affecting millions of people's lives. So this is a regret motion, right? We think the opposition have to defend the status quo, which means that no mass prosecution or investigation really happens. We propose a counterfactual that, as the motion indicates, right, will prosecute the major leaders of the bank, right? Probably also like individual bankers, if they actively do very harmful things that just violating regulation, active harm, will also prosecute them and send them to jail, right? Second part, we think that the government is still very likely to bail out those important banks, right? They have good incentive to keep the economy running. They know if the bank fails that people lose more money and there's a huge, a bigger clash, right? Thirdly, I want to point out that probably not all people that we prosecute will go to prison, but the process of prosecution and investigation itself increase transparency and customer confidence. We'll further elaborate later, right? We'll also tell you, right, in the status quo, right, only 2 people being prosecuted and 1 just middle level, for example, like a banker from Credit Suisse really being arrested. It's not really a high profile trial. People don't believe that government have done enough job, right? First, on principle level, why we think a criminal prosecution is justified in this case, right? First, on the scale of social hazard, right, we think that during this recession, right, millions of people at JFC harms millions of people's life in USA, probably also damage billions of lives all over the world indirectly, because when US economy starts, right, all the global demand, investment, and financial system had a huge crash, right? Secondly, we believe that the state have the obligation and the US government so actually can prosecute, and launch such large-scale investigation, right? Citizens elect this government and they give their right to do many things. Like when they trust the government, you will help us regulate the financial system, and the current system fails. That's why all state, if they have obligation, if they do not do that, no other government can do this effectively, right? Thirdly, right, we believe that even in the best case scenario, the wing of opposition try to argue that those major bank leaders do not actively do bad things. We can prove you, we'll prove to you, right? They are actively just let bad things happening. They clearly know from the bottom to middle layer to top layer, they know that some very risky behavior are happening, right? Something, if the activity is going on, the bubble breaks, very bad things happening. And they just let this happen. They take millions of dollars in their pocket and just let people hide, right? They turn a blind eye. This action of negligence itself is a crime, even if you do not really actively kill people or do bad things, right? If you believe that, for example, in a car accident, right, one person do not actively kill other person, but still cause big damage, and we would just prosecute that person in most cases, right? We believe that the lack of failure to fulfill the obligation that you should have is a good principle foundation for us to prosecute those leaders, which they should have done much better, right? 2 arguments. First on short-term, second on long-term impacts, right? First, short-term. Why we just get much faster recovery? We think in the status quo, what happened are really bad because people are scared. First, as an impact of the recession, they lose money, they default their house, they lose job, they live a very bad life, right? More importantly, they lose the trust over the Wall Street or the financial system, which you as built on. They feel this system failed, and government do not really do active job to fix it, or fix it to help people and to catch the punish bad people who actively cause this, right? It looks like, for example, right, there's a lot of like capital flight, right? Investors feel that US is no longer promising land to do investment, a lot of capital flight and withdrawal. It looks like the average individual do not want to consume because they do not know if the future is a sustainable one, so have to save money. Also looks like they do not reinvest in their economy through different methods, like bonds, like let's say stock market, etc., right? Which means, right, as a result, right, just the US economy do not get enough reinvestment or new confidence to make it revive, right? And we think this impact is very, very huge. We already explained to you how directly affect like millions of people's US people's life. And US they are a huge market for global inputs and goods and services. That's why you can see so many other countries, all let's say European, who have very close financial connection with the US also get severely affected, right? On our side, we have a much stronger intervention. It looks like a prompt prosecution with thorough investigation and due process. At least we have two impacts, right? First, people have more faith in the system. They see that the government is actively doing something to fix the problem and to punish bad people, right? They feel that the government will be able to help me in the future. Secondly, right, the investigation process itself, we think it largely increases transparency, right? Even if we do not necessarily send many people in the jail, we know we introduced an important third party, the police and court system, right? Through investigation, we're able to better discover what problem happens and fix them so that we know have better transparency and we know the solution for this, right? Secondly, more these bad things or things are exposed to the public and media can put additional eye on it, and people feel that they get an agency, they're being well informed, they're not just kept in a blind eye, right? Thirdly, on long term, right? So we think in the long term, right, this prosecution set very good deterrence. We're able to change the morally hazard approach that's currently done by many banks, right? It looks like, when we talk about morally hazard approach, it looks like, company always do, risk-seeking things, right? But they'll say, no, they will be bailed out anyway. And in the best case, when opposition try to argue, okay, people will get, leaders will get fired, but yes, they still get home with millions of money, they can retire very peacefully, and they're not being shamed at all, or probably very less likely, right? And they're very likely to do so because these banks are profit-seeking, right? They usually use very heavy leverage, which means if it fails so much harm, they cannot shoulder, right? Thirdly, there's a huge race to bottom problem because one bank seeing other banks doing this and make a lot of profits, they all do this, right? Only in our side, when we tell the major leaders, and if you do not regulate yourself and bad things happen, we send you to jail. Obviously, right, if they do something, it can be much better. They have huge capital, millions of capital. If they do some better regulation, they should not feel, even if there's certain accident happen somewhere in the world, right? Within innate internal regulations is the very important point because there's so many financial innovation or new investment tools come up every day. You cannot expect government to just keep up to date all about this and have up-to-date regulation. That's why it's the only way that we have internal regulation. When they know some new tools is coming up, we set a regulation, set rules for them. We do not do too many risky things, right? We think, right, we just reach better regulation. When we send people in jail, we take away the lobbying power. They stay in the jail. We just destroy their reputation, right? We also have more political capital because we get people's support. There's much more likely to have public incentive support for all the regulation. Then also for the transparency for less and severe financial recession in the future. Very honored to propose.
The opposition has come out to give you many benefits and harms that they think would have occurred if we had actually criminally prosecuted these bankers. However, I think it is mostly driven by a principle to prosecute for greed. However, it ignores the very real practical harms that would have occurred had this trial gone through. All of their benefits, all of their harms rely on the trial actually succeeding. There is a reason the Obama administration didn't criminally prosecute these bankers. It's because it would have no doubt resulted in a failed trial, leading to less accountability, fewer bailouts, and a stagnation of the global financial crisis. I have two things that I'll be proving today. Firstly, why we see these prosecutions would have certainly failed, leading to less accountability for these banks. And then secondly, why there would have been less bailouts if they had actually criminally prosecuted, leading to a stagnation of, leading to a continuation of the global financial crisis effects. First, on why we see the prosecutions would have failed had they gone through. Quite simply, it's already in the topic. A criminal prosecution has a much higher threshold than could have possibly been met had they actually gone through with this. As opposed to a civil suit, you actually need to go beyond a reasonable doubt, not just the balance of probabilities, meaning you would have had to meet a far higher burden of proof. Why would they have not met this? Because it would have meant that you had to search through discoveries in the millions, going through many, many papers in order to hopefully get a shred of evidence, which not only actually shows that they committed the act, but also that they had that mental element. The opposition seems to rely on that we should have prosecuted them for negligence. They were being terrible. Lots of financial crimes actually instead rely on actual knowledge. You have to show that there was actually a belief that they were going to cause this financial crisis. Whereas in actuality, a lot of them were just relying on it because it was seen that subprime loans were just good for the shareholders. It would be very hard to actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they were intending or acting with reckless negligence and not just raising the value for shareholders. We also see that had they gone through this trial, there would be a massive resource inequality between the two parties. The US government would have just been one agency with a limited amount of funding, having to prosecute lots and lots of banks who engaged in this. Banks, by the name, tend to have a lot of money. They would have been able to really fight back against this trial, and they would have had a lot more resources than the US government could possibly have, especially since the US government would have to fight tenfold as opposed to just the banks, which have to go against one litigant. So, because of this, because of their massive pool of resources, we would have also seen that they've got better teams of lawyers because they are paid better. Beyond that, they've got more experience in things like financial crimes because banks in America especially are super litigious. They're more likely to have experience in this field, more likely to drag it on and be able to win and lead to this trial being dropped. And then also we see the government lawyers are more likely to have more codes and models that they have to abide by, like the Model Litigant Code, meaning that they wouldn't have been able to engage in the slimy tactics that maybe the banks would have, such as sending lots and lots of papers so that they drown them in discovery for years and years and years. And then we also see, because this was a new financial sort of problem that wasn't expected, we can't really expect the law to have actually been developed in this case. It was a surprise to everyone, and it will be a surprise to the law as well. Judges tend to err on the side of caution, not really litigating if they don't think it meets the exact rule of law, and we think it would be likely that it wouldn't meet these requirements. And because also these criminal trials would have been decided by juries, we think they would have been not as financially literate as is necessary to actually get a criminal prosecution. And they also, because of things like bias, wouldn't have been those actually affected by the global financial crisis. You can't really have someone on the jury whose house was foreclosed because of the global financial crisis. Instead, they're likely to be well-off people who perhaps either don't care about the people who suffered, or they instead care about the viability of banks and are more likely to sort of let them off because they are likely to be richer since they weren't necessarily affected by the financial crisis. So, because of all the reasons I've given you, we see that as well as that, it's going to be an extremely prolonged trial because of the mountains of evidence, because you're having to go against every bank which has truckloads of resources. Even if they were able to succeed against this mountain of problems, it would be so far into the future that would have passed the public conscious, and we wouldn't be getting that accountability which the opposition seeks to collect. So that brings me on to my impacts of what would happen even if this trial were to succeed, and it would be super far out, but more likely the case that it doesn't succeed. Firstly, we get no accountability because which is what all of their benefits sort of hinge on, actually getting this trial to come to place. But beyond that, we see that it even worsens accountability, because in the eyes of the law, they know that they'd succeed in court, these banks. They know they've got it sort of written. Whereas in the status quo, they were sort of spooked off by the massive effects and backlash from the global financial crisis, and they haven't engaged in as much risk-taking behavior. Here, they would have gone through a trial in which they would have succeeded. They would have been able to stop the government prosecuting them, meaning they would have incentivized risk-taking behavior in the future, because they know that they can get away with it in the future. They know that it's unlikely to actually have any effect on them. And then lastly, we think just from the people, there would have been such backlash against this government, whereas in the status quo, it just was never really much of a possibility that was thought. Here, the hope is being given that they'll actually face their crimes, and it's being taken away, as opposed to just having no hope and instead working on the practical outcomes of bailing out these banks, which would mean that it's a waste of resources, and the taxpayer would see it as money which could have instead gone to actually helping them bounce back from this global financial crisis. Because it was affected by so many people, this would waste money that could otherwise go to actual cost of living measures, making sure that people actually practically are able to bounce back from the global financial crisis, and not just try and do this trial that's going to ultimately fail. So why do we also see that bailouts would occur to a lesser extent, and what are the impacts of this? Firstly, we think there would have been inherent signalling issues in between. So while the opposition, yes, says that you would get this bailout still, we believe that there would be inherent signalling issues in criminally prosecuting them while also bailing them out. It's unlikely that they would have done this to the extent or at all if they were also criminally prosecuting them, because it would be, in the optics, it would be like they were giving the money to criminals in order to bring back sort of society, and it's unlikely that would have been politically favorable. Secondly, it would have sort of accentuated the idea in at least the public sphere that these are people who are criminals, these are people who deserve to be prosecuted, and because of this, there would be a severe backlash to actually bailing them out, and it wouldn't be as seen as favorably. And even if we do see them being bailed out, we see that the banks would be very undermined by this trial and would be unable to actually bring society back from the GFC. Because one reason is because even if the trials were to succeed, they would be incredibly undermined because of these massive fines that would have occurred towards them. Right now, after the GFC, they needed every resource they could have in order to actually invest and bring back the banks from the ruin that they were in order to actually bring back financial stability. And then secondly, we also see that just banks in general, the board of directors would be bogged down by this lengthy criminal prosecution because of the amount of resources that they would have had to spend on it, leading to less time going into crucial measures to actually bring back financial stability. The impacts of this is that the banks would already be fractured at this point, and they would be undermined even more. People would be less likely to put their money in banks, meaning they would stagnate even further, and we would see an increase of the effects of the GFC just because of this trial, which would ultimately not succeed. Thank you.
You all good?
Yeah.
I think what AF ignores here is the legal realities of trying to prosecute every single director and major banker who caused a problem in the GFC, in which most banks in America at the very least, had a culture in which it was absolutely primed to do these sorts of loans which caused the crisis. That is to say that the scope and the degree of harms and the difficulty through which they can actually prosecute these groups is insane. They can't do it. I'll explain why in this speech. And they also just cannot, as a result, First of all of their benefits literally fall out as soon as we can prove that these prosecutions fail. And secondly, we also prove to you at Daniel that there are a number of harms which come from that failure to no response from second half. Two things in this speech. First, on why they still do fail, and then second, on recovery and the principle. Okay,
starting with the sort of next we heard at second app just then. I think the first is that like the idea that like since the government spent 800 billion on bailouts, they have the money and time to win. The first thing is don't underestimate the cost of this. For instance, Australia is a fairly small country. When it tried to prosecute one company, one set of directors, in a very short case, comparatively, that cost 20 million. We are now talking about most major companies, almost every banker, as defined as first app. That is a lot of litigation, and that is a ridiculous amount of cost and time. Now, I'm not saying the government doesn't have that money, but what it is to say is that at the very least takes years. It takes the DOJ putting all of its resources into that one bag, and that looks like basically putting all of your eggs in one basket. Not only does that mean that you really, really need to succeed, or they have absolutely failed for a lot of people, it also means that they stop other cases. They don't do other criminal litigations because all the resources are now being filtered into this one party. It now means that they're staking the entire success of this on the success of their litigation. Make that very clear. If they don't get these litigations failing, they will have so many harms to gain here. The other thing is that they just ignore all of our content we give you at Daniel about the legal realities of trying to win a case. We told you first of all that burdens of proof such as beyond a reasonable doubt mean that you need to actually prove a loss to actually get a criminal prosecution. That is to say that they can't just assume that there's a problem. They have to actually find damning evidence that they had actual knowledge, as we told you yet again with the mental element, that they knew that they were doing was wrong and that they intended to do so essentially. And that's and again to no response. Criminal negligence does not work in this case. Most of these sort of provisions don't apply to this thing. The second thing we heard is that they'll just publish the documents online. Very clearly, you can't publish things in discovery. They're confidential. Move on. Next, we heard that government leverage. The government can basically just leverage the banks into doing this. I think, first of all, I think that's sort of a bit hazy in terms of legality, in terms of trying to basically give undue influence and just force these corporations to comply with your means by trying to basically ruin them and make them go bankrupt. I think there's already a problem there. But even if they do that, they lose the bailouts, which means that they deepen the GFC, which means that they get all of those economic harms, they lose all those jobs, they lose all those homes, and all the things that those bailouts were meant to do aren't in place anymore. So that just way deepens them anyway, so even if they were to succeed. And that moves on to when they said that banks will simply comply. And as we've told you down the bench, the reason why they won't comply is because they actually think they can win. As we told you, prosecutors do have a public duty, and that is to say that they have a set of standards, they have to comply by the rules. When you have all the weight of Manhattan's best lawyers trying to take down the government, they're not going to play fair, they're probably going to do some pretty shady shit, and they're probably not going to win. Okay, finally, we heard that they'll just pay private firms to do this. I think this just, again, makes their costs absolutely ludicrous, and that is just to say that I don't think this has ever occurred ever where there's been a tentative alliance between government prosecutors and every single private firm, and I think this is just a total mischaracterization of how the legal system works, particularly in the United States where there is so much tension between the government and the private firms, and there is likely to be conflict, and there is likely to be a disagreement on how to do these sorts of things. That is to say that they simply do not prove at any point that they are actually going to succeed in these. That is their burden. They get zero of their benefits in their side of the case if they can prove to you, if they cannot prove to you the very basic point that they actually succeed in their prosecution. Second thing today, first on their principle, I think the first thing, which is the idea that they have a responsibility to do this. I think and the first thing to note is that prosecutors do have a duty. Number one, that is in the public interest, and that is a case is only in the public interest if they think they can win it, right? And that is to say that there is actually no principal responsibility here if they don't think that they can win. So I think at least it does sort of fall out. The other thing to say is that because of the significant amount of resources which are being pumped into these sorts of cases, that is that this the sort of the money and the time which I've already sort of characterized to you is extremely important in this case. It means that it is entirely unprincipled for them to do this. That is to say that they only have one shot. You can't double prosecute. You cannot also, by the way, go into discovery, find new things, and then act on it. All these things that just simply cannot happen. That is to say that you need to pick your target, pick it right. You only have one shot, and then you also have all those other difficulties we told you about, and all those extremely high burdens, right? That is to say that if you fail, the severe consequences which you told you are incredible. That is to say that you let banks off. in a way which like gives them no accountability. It is so bad for the public, especially those who care so deeply about what the sort of harms that were caused to them by the GFC. That also doesn't occur on our side of the case in the way that like there was extreme public pressure on banks to change their corporate cultures and to end these sorts of practices, and as well as SEC regulation, which also went unresponded to, mind you. The idea that like the SEC actually did, in our side of the case, really tighten the economic regulations and change the sort of priorities of banks. That doesn't occur on their side of the case, because if they know that they cannot actually win, and they cannot, when banks know that they can beat the government, when they know that the government doesn't have the resources to actually do it, they're more likely to continue to skirt economic regulations. They're more likely to essentially try new types of malpractice. They have no accountability to that government. It undermines the government's legitimacy and their ability to regulate these banks. It causes all the more harms that continue to happen into the future. And I think all the while, it sort of proves to everybody just how lethargic and unenthusiastic the government is, how they are completely unable to defend them, and especially when they're losing their homes, losing their jobs, something they just cannot account for on their side of the case, which none of their benefits, even at their best, do not help them on this regard. And so I think this sort of proves that this is unprincipled in every kind of way. Now, quickly on recovery, and that is to note that like they don't give you any sort of response to what we told you at Daniel about bailouts. We tell you that this is enough, even alone, to try and to be a path of victory for us. In that, like we tell you that without the effects of bailouts and by stymieing these sorts of companies, you deepen the GFC's effects. You cause more economic harms to people, which is the reason why you want to criminally prosecute in the first place. So that's just a thing. But beyond that, first of all, we heard that there will be on foster recovery. First, we heard there will be capital flight. I think this is just clearly a mischaracterization. The US remains the center of trade and commerce, despite the fact that we didn't have those private firms, and it is still essential, even despite the whole Trump thing, it is still a central core. You can prove that by the way that which every single thing that Trump does now still has extreme impacts on the economic markets of the entire world. That suggests that there was not capital flight. Okay, second, that people are informed and optimistic. I think, again, this just relies on their material on the success of the prosecution. That is to say that, like, even if it doesn't fail, there'll be no enthusiasm from the public. That is to say that, but that is also to say that like even if it does succeed, with the amount of time and money and the fact that you're probably not even going to get that many successes anyway, this is going to be quite a high burden for them to prove that people will actually be enthusiastic about this, particularly if you're talking years and years into the future after like there's been no other government litigation where they're pouring all their resources into this. Finally, on long-term deterrence, I think this is the best metric because we tell you that we give you SEC regulation and that there's also a lot of public pressure on companies to change their economic cultural practices, but I think also just very clearly they set a precedent that they can beat the government in what they do, that they therefore are more likely to continue to do these sorts of malpractices, and for that reason we're very, very proud to oppose.
If you are a parent and your child comes home beaten and bloody and bruised from the playground, you don't just give them a Band-Aid, you give them a Band-Aid, you give them a hug, and then you investigate and find out what the fuck happened to your child. That is what we're talking about here, because the American people were screwed over, they were hurt, they were damaged, they were left homeless, they were left with no jobs and no health insurance, and it is the government's obligation to understand what happened at the very least. And maybe your child actually just fell off the slide, maybe it's fine, but as a parent, as someone who's in charge of these people, someone who's elected to lead them, it is your obligation to figure out what happened to your child, what happened to the American people, and get justice for them. What that should prove to you in this debate is that we don't even need this to be successful, but you have an obligation to find out literally just what happened. What that does in this debate takes place before Trump. People still have faith in the American democracy on our side. People have faith that the American government will give them justice, will give them the ability to get good outcomes. This team needs to explain why they are the ones who are able and willing to knife the American government's integrity, to tell the American people, we don't care, you got screwed over, here's $10, here's a plaster, but we're not going to find out what happened to you. And they need to get over this incredibly high bar in this debate. Our principle is that you have an obligation to find out what happened, do an investigation. It does not matter if it is successful or not. They need to get over this bar to land any benefits in this debate, or they need to slam dunk on the practical material. I don't think they do either of those things. That's the principle. The next thing I'm going to do in my speech is deal with whether these are likely to be successful. Then I'll talk about the recovery. Then I will drive home quite a significant path to victory on the long-term regulations. Let's talk about whether these succeed or not, because this is where the affirmative, this is the next path to victory, right? They say that we had our win conditions to prove that these succeed. But what we explained to you, Josh, 2M is right. We don't individually respond to the mechanisms that they give you in their speech, but we actually just don't need to. You can credit them with this entire argument, and we still win this debate because because they explain that it's really hard to get probable regulation. But we explain there's a series of benefits, Josh, that are independent of this, because you get information, because you find the loopholes so that you can can close them, because you restore faith in the American democracy and the American financial system. Those are all reasons why you can credit them with their entire first affirmative speech in this debate, and we still win. But let's be incredibly charitable here. Let's say it is very expensive and it's really, really hard to do this, and the government really, really struggles, and maybe they're poor. What we explain is probably this just means the government does this in a good way. Obviously, they have incentives to not become poor and not become bankrupt as the American government. So maybe they do 200 prosecutions rather than 2,000 on our side. That seems totally fine, because what is actually likely is that the government does this well. They probably pick to prosecute the cases that they think are most likely to result in criminal convictions. Which means on our side, maybe we only have 200 cases, but maybe 75% of those result in prosecutions or result in convictions. Whereas on their side, you have a much more diluted muddy water. If the government picks to focus on only a certain number of cases and they do really well, obviously that is debate winning for us. But also they explain that it's too far in the future and it gets drawn out and it's bad. But clearly the government just does this well and fast tracks it. We explain that we don't need this to win this debate, and I think engaging with them most charitably, even if we only get 200 prosecutions, that is totally fine. Let's talk about the short-term GFC recovery, because this is where they state the rest of their material, noting that our long-term pathway is entirely independent and just is debate winning, but I think we can win here too. They have two claims on the GFC recovery. The first is that this trial is expensive and that it is a huge waste of money, but we explain that the government just has the upper hand here. They can subpoena you, they can get this information, they can they literally just can be we're going to give you less bailout money if you mess up around and do that kind of bullshit stuff that they talk about. But even if it is true that the banks go to war on this and they spend lots and lots of money, if the executive of a bank has to put 200 million of their own personal money into this to finance their side of the investigation, that is totally fine with us. We think that that's $200 million less for lobbying against regulations. That is $200 million less to do the damaging things that we tell you exist on our side. If this trial is expensive, we don't think it's a waste of money. The US has an obligation to do this, to look after its children. We think that this is a perfectly fine use of money on our side. And what we would explain is that maybe this costs $70 million, but $70 million, if you divide it by every American who was affected by the GFC, it's probably $2 per person. I think this is a much more utile use of the government's money, even if they could have used it to give everyone a loaf of bread or something. Cool. Their second claim here is that they get less bailouts because there is backlash, because you don't bail out and give money to criminals. But there just isn't backlash against bailouts, for the simple reason that when banks failed and when the GFC happened, people lost their mortgages and they lost their homes. But if those banks collapsed entirely, now you lose every bit of money you have in that. Now you lose your 10 grand in your savings account that you worked for decades to be able to unlock and save. And that means that there just is not backlash against bailouts ever, because it's the government securing your money in your bank. If the government is making sure that you can access your savings in your investment, obviously that is a good thing. Obviously there is no backlash against these individuals, but against the bailouts themselves, we still get bailouts on our side. We explain in setup at Aaron that these bailouts still have to occur because that's the way the financial system works in America. We still get bailouts. I think that pretty neatly deletes their path to victory on the GFC recovery. But I think it gets worse for this negative team when they don't respond to our material, because what we explain is that we increase consumer confidence, we increase investment. This is the first time in the 2000s that the US financial system has fundamentally failed its people, and we are the side that tells where the government says you will not get away with this. We're going to find out what happened. We're going to fix our system, and that is the kind of thing that means that investment money goes back into America. It is reinvested into the country. People say things like, "Oh, the stock market is on sale. I'm going to put my stocks into America," rather than, "Oh, I'm going to go to Australia because I know they have regulation and they prosecute people where they do shitty fucked up things." So people will invest in the economy much sooner on our side. We get that means we get jobs, we get job creation, we get people back. Maybe you lose your house symmetrically, but on our side you have a job that comes with healthcare and health insurance. On their side you have none of that, because no one wants to invest in America, and you don't have the capital to up and leave to Australia. On our side then we get a much better GFC recovery that is much more egalitarian, that helps much more people. We get people their houses, we get people their health insurance, we get people their jobs in the short term. This team does not overcome that. Let's talk about the long term then. The first thing I'm going to do here is just weigh this long term, because what we explain to you is the long term is incredibly important. It affects lots of people now and into the future, but this also affects all sectors, because what we explain at Josh and at Aaron is that we get companies to internally regulate so that they self-regulate and they do better things, and we get better lobbying and better regulations at a government level. And not that this just crosses all sectors, right? Because the fact that even if people do things and they're not actually illegal, but then the government does the investigation and is like, "Oh, this is a loophole, we should probably close, let's regulate it," then you as an executive of a bank are like, you as an executive, maybe an OpenAI executive in the year 2024, are like, "I'm not going to do dodgy shit that I know is immoral, that I know is going to lead to bad outcomes, and then I'll be investigated, and then I'll be prosecuted, or the government will create these new regulations." So this isn't just about the banking sector, it affects everyone. If we get better regulations, we get better self-regulation, that affects every sector, and it ricochets through the banking sector, through the technology sector, to all areas of the oligopoly of America. We make it better on our side. this team tells you that you don't get accountability because you don't win, but then they say that you get away scot-free and you beat the government on our side, but obviously they get away scot-free and they beat the government because they're never prosecuted, because you just walked away and are not even told that you might be a criminal on their side. Obviously, this is the type of thing that happens under them, not under us, but we just get these better regulations because you investigate, you do the investigation and you're like, oh, there was a crime here, and maybe in this instance where there was not a crime, this particular piece of behavior that occurred should have been a crime, and then you make it a crime, and we just get much better, and we just get that when you only get that when you do the investigation on our side, which happens, which means two things. One, it means we close the loopholes, but two, it means that future execs self-regulate against this behavior. As I flagged in my way, there's not only this sector, but every sector, which is just fantastic for communities, because we have an independent pathway here on lobbying. They say that they get regulations in the SEC, but the problem with their regulations is they were walked back later because every banking executive had $200 million on their side. On our side, they don't have that money because maybe they spent it all on legal fees, or maybe they were found guilty and thrown in jail and could not access that money, or maybe they used, I don't know, they just have less money on our side, they have less power, they have less political power, which means that our regulations are just better. We explain a series of reasons that Aaron are unresponded to about why we have more political capital for regulations on our side, because this is a big media circus. But at the end of this debate, I think you should just believe that if your child is beaten up on the playground, you have an obligation to find out what happened to them. And especially if it gives you benefits in the long run, if it prevents another kid from being beaten up, that is something that you should do.
How do we circumvent them on the long-term effect? What we explain is that in the vast majority of cases, that these prosecutions are likely to fail, and they say this still sets a precedent that they can waive the legal threat at companies that we will do this, we've done it in the past. The problem is that legal threat is now toothless because it's been proven in a court of law that these don't succeed. These companies don't have to be afraid of those prosecutions. They have to invest less money in defending them because they've done it before. That is the point at which you circumvent, that is the point at which this does not become a long-term solution. This gives companies the green light to continue doing risk-taking behaviors because they know in reality, they are never going to face the legal liability and consequences in court. That is the long-term effect you see when these prosecutions fail, and that is why you can believe all the stuff at our first negative speech, and we win the debate. A couple of things in this speech. Firstly, on accountability. Secondly, on economic recovery. Firstly, on accountability, and I just want to note at the top here that clearly investigations have taken place in the status quo, whether that occurred through, for example, the government doing active investigation into the banking sector. Maybe they didn't lead to legal liability, but obviously we know how the GFC occurred. Also, that occurred through things like media. That is to suggest there is still some level of accountability that existed on our side that didn't necessarily need to result in criminal prosecution action. That is the burden that they need to meet in this debate. That is the first thing I want to note here. What do they tell you? We tell you these prosecutions in the vast majority of cases do not succeed. How do they respond? The first thing they explain is that, well, the government is incredibly well resourced because they spent $700 billion in bailouts and they can afford to spend that much money on litigation. The first thing I would say is just, it is impossible to underestimate the amount that litigation costs. That is because we explained that, for example, as Quinn says in his speech, Australia defending its claim, the claim brought against it by Philip Morris cost $20 million to defend, even though Australia ended up winning that case. That was against one company. Note that the US is obviously a far bigger economy than Australia, and any litigation is likely to be incredibly prolonged because lawyers have the incentive to do dodgy tactics like bogging them down in document discovery and so on, and because you just need to beef up your department and employ the amount of people to go through those sorts of documents. That means the government has to spend an enormous amount of money doing these litigations. But I think where we truly take them out here is we explain that this is asymmetric between the government and between the banks they need to prosecute. That is because the DOJ is one agency trying to prosecute multiple actors, including both major banks and individual bankers. Each of them have their own separate departments and legal teams to defend them, which means they put all their resources into defending that one claim, whereas the government has to prosecute everyone at the same time. That just explains there is a massive asymmetry in the resources between them. So even if the government put heaps of money into this, they still cannot counter the fact they are trying to manage multiple prosecutions at the same time against incredibly well-resourced banks with incredibly good litigation teams that have a significant amount of experience in defending these sorts of claims, because as we explained, banks are incredibly litigious in the US. That is why that is not true. Secondly, they try and tell us, well, actually, banks will comply in this case. There are a couple of reasons why that's not true. Firstly, because, as we explained, we just think they think that they can win. But secondly, and more importantly, it's because these sorts of legal threats pose a fundamental and existential threat to the freedom of bankers to like go about their daily lives. And probably if you're the CEO of a bank or you're a director, you don't want to go to jail, and therefore you're going to direct the company to put all your resources into defending you from doing that. That is why banks will not comply, because the sorts of people that they are targeting are the people at the top of the chain, and they don't want to go to jail. What do they tell you next? They then tell you that the government has really good lawyers and they can defend this really well, and maybe they'll even do it pro bono. So a couple of reasons why the government has less good lawyers than banks. That is because governments pay you less as a lawyer, because government wages they suck and they're more accountable to the public, and public servant lawyers just get a lot less money. That's why I'm doing corporate law and I'm not staying in my government. Second, lawyers do pro bono because they for companies and for individuals who cannot pay. Obviously the government is not such an actor because they clearly have a lot of capital and they do pay in other instances. But also, this is a case that is likely to take multiple years and is going to be a lot of work. Lawyers need to eat as well. Obviously, they need to be paid for this sort of work. But fourthly, we just explained there are certain standards and codes that are imposed on government lawyers because they are accountable to the public, because they are paid out of the public purse, that are not imposed upon private lawyers, which means that those private lawyers and corporate lawyers can in fact engage in really slimy litigation tactics that government lawyers need to actually get around, and that makes litigation far, far more difficult. I think even in their best case where some of these succeed, they're incredibly protracted, they take an extremely long time, and that increases people's anger because people already believe that the legal system is ineffective because it is so slow and because it doesn't impose high penalties. So these sorts of things are likely to get lost. But the next thing they explain is, well, actually, it doesn't matter if we lose because we get all of these other benefits anyways. Here are why those benefits don't work. The first thing they say is it sets a precedent. I dealt with this in my introduction, which is that the precedent it sets is bad because now any time the government weighs that legal threat at another company, that company just goes, well, we've won this before, this is easy to defend, this is not something we ought to be afraid of, we're going to continue engaging in risk-taking behavior, and that also just means that litigation you don't need to spend as much money defending yourself in that. The second thing they claim is the process of discovery unlocks a bunch of other legal loopholes that we can now regulate on and that we can start new litigations on. The first thing is, as we explain at Quinn, anything in discovery is confidential, that cannot be released to the public, so clearly this is just not a harm they can claim. But secondly, and I realise I'm kind of getting a bit into spec knowledge here, but in law, when you have certain documents that are disclosed for a particular proceeding, you cannot disclose them for the purposes of another proceeding or a new litigation. It's called the Harmon undertaking. And what that explains in this debate is that you can't use those documents to start new policy, and you can't use those documents to start new litigations. And what that explains is they cannot do this. This process of discovery is not helpful for anything other than the litigation that's likely to fail. What do they then tell you? They say, well, at least some will be successful. I think probably that would be against the smallest fish in these cases. Those are the sorts of people that we don't care about as much and the public doesn't care about as much. Their anger and sense of justice is not sated. This is going to be less reported in the media. We explained that the amount of money that is poured into this that leads to zero accountability is what causes people to lose faith in the government, because that money could have been spent on economic recovery. It could have been spent on more bailouts, which allowed the economy to recover faster. Those sorts of things, instead of on failed prosecutions, that's when you get better faith in the government. That is incredibly important. And again, this is how we circumvent them on the long term, because they set that precedent. And that precedent is something that we ought not stand by. Secondly, in terms of economic recovery, because I think we just proved there is no accountability on their side. They cannot run away with a principled obligation because that principle is entirely contingent on them succeeding in these prosecutions. Let's talk about economic recovery then. They say a couple of things. Firstly, they say we are going to lack investment because your government is seen as worse and less accountable, etc. The first thing I would just suggest in the GFC is that it was global, so where are the investors flying to, I guess? And also, the US is still the largest economy and was probably still perceived as relatively stable, so obviously investors are going to stay and invest still as well. The next thing they explain is you're going to have more faith in the government. But what we do is we flip this, because we say that when prosecutions fail, the government looks far weaker, and also the government has spent a lot of money that could have been going directly into the pockets of other people and helping them get, rent assistance and food and grocery assistance. Those sorts of things are the things people actually care about when that crisis affects their day-to-day lives. And when that money has been spent on prosecutions that fail, that is when people stop trusting the government and think the government is doing stupid things. And that is obviously when you get more political reactionary attitudes. That is obviously far, far worse. They then explain, well, we actually get better regulation on our side, and that is a really good long-term benefit. The first thing I would say is there is clearly other reasons why regulation is likely to get better, because the GFC was bad and people were really poorly affected by it. So the government still has significant amounts of incentives to do that sort of regulation. But what we explain is they have less resources to do this on our side because the DOJ is responsible for doing things like policy reform and law reform. They are now spending so much money on these prosecutions, and their legal teams are totally concerned with that. That means they have no resources to do this sort of regulation. regulation. We explain this lessens your ability to do bailouts, there's less capital, and it is contradictory. It undermines the bank's recovery because they are paying fines and litigation stuff. That is what stops the economy recovering in the long term. Very, very proud to oppose.